All right, so you are doing GitOps. Awesome. So you're trendy. And you have chosen FluxCD as a tool for that. You're now deploying applications and you're getting users on board. And the thing is, if you're a DevOps engineer implementing FluxCD, I'm sure you've seen discussions around how do we give developers actually a dashboard or a developer platform that they can use to manage and support their applications post-deployment. Today, with Flux, there's no such platform in place. So a lot of the DevOps teams that we talk to, they say that their developers are actually coming back to them to help with support because it's hard for them to understand the object relationship of their applications and the status and so on. So how can you quickly solve that? Especially if you already have applications being deployed, you need a solution that can land on top of your FluxCD implementation easily and deliver value quickly to your developer. On the other side, as you scale the number of applications and users, you gotta make sure that you start bringing some structure around so you can easily identify who owns the services. So when there's a problem with a service, you can quickly identify the owner, go back to them, and ask for help to troubleshoot the services directly from the developer, rather than you having to figure out who owns what. So how can you quickly do that? Let's see it. All right, so for this, I'm gonna be using GK. You can use AKS, EKS, whatever K you have in there, as long as it's Kubernetes. I'm using GK, and I already have kubectl. If I run get namespace, I see that I have Flux system. So we're not covering how to install Flux. I'm assuming you already have Flux installed. And if I run get deployments, for example, I see I have a pod info app already deployed. If I check this structure, that pod info app is actually being deployed already through FluxCD. I already have the application definition here, which is pointing to my pod info GitHub app. So any changes here gets deployed by Flux. GitOps stuff, right? So I have that. The question is, now that I'm at the same place as you are. You already have Flux, you already have your Kubernetes, and you already have apps. How do we start surfacing those apps? For that today, we're going to be using Shippa Cloud. That is by far the quickest and best way to get your applications surfaced. And I say that because you can create an account for free. You can create an account on apps.shippa.cloud and get started, and everything that we're going to be doing here today costs you $0. Now, how do we get started? I'm going to be using what Shippa calls policy frameworks. That's how Shippa binds the Shippa services to your cluster, right? And enforces policies, controls. We're not going to be focusing on that stuff. I just want my applications to be surfaced so my developers can see it and understand it. But because Shippa does that connection through policy frameworks, that's where we start. For that to work, we have to select the advanced model because Shippa Policy Frameworks has something called App Discovery, and that is what we need. So we'll click on Next. I'll have to enter a name for this policy framework. I can call it FluxCD. And the one thing to notice here is the Kubernetes namespace field. It is marked as not required, and it is not. If you create a Shippa policy framework and bind it to your cluster without mentioning which namespace, Shippa will create a namespace for that policy framework. So everything deployed using that policy will get deployed to that namespace. But going back to our use case, we already have a namespace, we already have applications deployed, and I want to surface that. For that, you have to enter the namespace where your applications are deployed so Shippa can watch over that namespace and surface your applications. In my case, it's actually deployed using the default namespace. So just enter default here. Then I can go next. It's about resource plane consumption. We're not talking about it. RBAC, application scalability limits, registry control, network policy, security scan, fun stuff, but that's not the goal today. here's what matters to us today. The app discovery. So this is the setup that Shippa is going to use to start discovering apps and surfacing them in the dashboard. The one thing that you are going to need to enter is the label. So Shippa can discover applications and objects using that label. As a quick way, I can go and see kubectl, get pods, for example, and do a describe. If I can type. I'll just get this. Here's all the information about my pod that was deployed by Flux. If I go into labels, I see that I already have a couple labels here, app and pod template hash. I'm going to be using app, right? So let's say you use a common label for all services deployed for a specific team or specific app. You can leverage that. In my case, I'm leveraging app. So if I go back to Shippa and I enter app, you don't need to enter a suffix. If you enter a suffix, such as Shippa, let's say, then when Shippa imports those apps or surface those apps, Shippa is going to add Shippa in front of it. So it's going to be Shippa-podinfo. But we don't need that. We want to keep it simple. We do create. The next step for us is to actually now bind this policy framework to our cluster where the app is deployed, so Shippa can connect to that namespace and surface the apps. We can do that by clicking on cluster, and then we can add cluster. We can call it FluxCD, for example. The name doesn't need to be the same name as the cluster. Whatever makes you happy, use it here. And we're going to select the policy framework that we want. We just created FluxCD, and that's the one we're going to be using because that's where we configured app discovery. If we click on next, I'm going to see that it asks for the cluster IP, token, and certificate. How can you get that information? Directly from Shippa's documentation. If you go to learn.shippa.io and you scroll down to the ops guide, there is a Kubernetes cluster section and then connecting cluster. This describes you how to get the information. So let's do that together. The cluster connection part, I have the command here to get the cluster IP. I can use this. Let's see. Here's my cluster IP. So let me go back to Shippa, enter that information here. The next information that Shippa asks to connect to that cluster is a token for the service account. You need to create a service account so Shippa can connect to that cluster and run whatever actions or initiatives you want it to run. You have more information around how to create a service account right here. I already have this file in place, but you can copy the content and use this one. I'm just gonna apply it. Great. The next step for me, now that the service account is created, I will retrieve the token for that service account. Here's my token. And I can paste it here. No issues around my token, cluster IP. By the time you see this video, the cluster is long gone, my friend. So don't even bother copying it. And the last part is getting the certificate, which is on part number 4. If I copy it here, I get my certificate. If I go back to Shippa, I can paste it here. The last step is ingress controller. I'm not customizing anything. I want to keep it simple. So I just hit create. What Shippa is going to do now is Shippa will connect to it will reach out to your cluster, will create a namespace called Shippa, will deploy its services there. And because we created a policy framework called Flux pointing to the default namespace, Shippa will start running an app discovery in that namespace, apps with label app. If you want to see the progress, you can head down to events, and this will show you the process of connecting the cluster. The connection takes about 60 seconds. So let's wait. done. I can see that it was successful. If I go to the clusters page, I see my FluxCD cluster connected. Yay! Now, if I go to my applications page, I already see my pod info application. Awesome. So my application starts surfacing here already. If I go into pod info, I can click on information. It shows me the owner. The owner is me because I did it. It shows me the namespace where this is actually bound to. Shows me the policy framework that Shippa is using. If I go into units, I can see the application units, some information around it, such as IP, name, and so on. The resources that it's actually requested. You can see the geographic location of your app units if you're running multi-region clusters and so on. And people always love a map. And if you go to application map, you can see my application deployed, and you can see information about the pods and the detailed information here. Shippa can surface more objects, as you can see. It all depends as having the label app to it. But great, now it's one app, and I didn't change my FluxCD process. I haven't changed or touched my GitOps process with Flux. I just plugged in Shippa on top and I start surfacing the application and the objects. But now let's say your developer goes in and your developer deploys a new app. Let's see if it picks up, right? I'm gonna be deploying a customized simple app. The first thing is I'm gonna use Flux CLI to create my customized simple app. I already have actually my app here, customized simple. So I'm just gonna be using Flux to deploy this application. I created a file. I'll do git add, call it customize, git push, regular Flux. Shippa does not interfere or change any of your process in this case. If we go back here to my Flux, I can see I'm committing the files. And the last step is to tell Flux to actually start deploying this application, right? Let me copy the command. Paste it here. And if I do a git add, and I do a git push again, great. If I go to my repo, I can do it here. GitHub works. And it's pointing here. If we go back to my kubectl, get deployment, I see Flux already started deploying production D deployment. It's right there. Yeah. So Flux works. My process is working. I'm not touching it, right? And if I do get pods, I can see the pods deployed by it, and it's deployed in the default namespace. And let's say describe pod. And I do this. Let's check the labels. Look at that. It has an app label right there. Who would think, right? So now it has an app label here, let's say, and it's in the default. Ideally, this application should automatically be surfaced on Shippa, so the developer or the owner can see the application there. Let's see if it works. Going back to Shippa, if I refresh, dun dun, right there. There, right there. You can see the demo app. If we go in, same thing. Now you as a DevOps person, you know who is the owner of the app, right? Who imported or connected that policy framework. You can see the owner of that application. So you can contact them in case there are problems. The unit information for that application, geographic distribution, and you can see the application map and the dependencies. You can see that here I'm labeling a few more objects. So you can see not only the units, but you can also see services associated to this and the information as well as the pod. So easily you can get a developer platform up and running, give your developers access to that. You don't need to change your FluxCD process. you can land a quick win with your developers and a quick win with your team, the DevOps team, because now you start pushing more of that visualization and support over to the developers. Next, we're going to be talking about how to use this to implement policies and controls, and even go further in terms of network maps and so on with Flux. So you bring Flux to an enterprise level. I hope that was helpful. And again, you can get started, and everything that we did here, it's basically free. You can sign up at apps.shippa.cloud, and we would love to hear your thoughts about it. We're still building it, and we'd love to have your input. Thank you for taking the time.